Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing reading The Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. We are almost there, maybe two more videos or so, and we'll be able to complete the whole thing. We are up to section 17, and with that said, I'll get started. Dionysian art also wants to convince us of the eternal delight in existence. But we must seek this delight not in appearances, but behind them. We must recognize how everything which comes into being must be ready for a painful destruction. We are forced to gaze directly into the terror of individual existence, but, in the process, must not become paralyzed. A metaphysical consolation tears us momentarily out of the hustle and bustle of changing forms. For a short time we really are the primordial essence itself, and feel its unbridled lust for and joy in existence. The struggle, torment, and destruction of appearances we now considered necessary, on account of the excess of countless forms of existence forcefully thrusting themselves into life, and of the exuberant fecundity of the world's will. We are transfixed by the raging barbs of this torment in the very moment when we become, as it were, one with the immeasurable primordial delight in existence, and when we sense the indestructible and eternal nature of this Dionysian joy. In spite of fear and compassion, we are fortunate vital beings, not as individuals, but as the one force of life, with whose procreative joy we have been fused. The story of how Greek tragedy arose tells us how with a clear certainty how the Greeks' tragic work of art really was born out of the spirit of music. With this idea we think we have, for the first time, reached a true understanding of the original and astonishing meaning of the chorus. At the same time, however, we must concede that the significance of the tragic myth explained previously, to say nothing of Greek philosophy, was never entirely clear to the Greek poets. Their heroes speak to a certain extent more superficially than they act, and the myth does not really find its adequate objectification in the spoken word. The structure of the scenes and the vivid images reveal a deeper wisdom than the poet himself can grasp in words and ideas. We can make the same observation about Shakespeare, whose Hamlet, for example, similarly speaks in a more superficial manner than he acts, so that we derive the above-mentioned study of Hamlet not from the words, but from the deepest view and review of the totality of the work. With respect to Greek tragedy, which of course comes to us only as a drama of words, I have even suggested where that incongruity between myth and word can easily seduce us into considering it shallower and more empty of meaning than it is, and thus to assume a more superficial action than it must have had according to the testimony of the ancients. For we easily forget that what the poet as a wordsmith could not achieve, the attainment of the highest intellectualization and idealization of myth, he could achieve successfully at any time as a creating musician. Admittedly, through scholarship, we must recreate the extraordinary power of the musical effects in order to receive something of that incomparable consolation necessarily characteristic of true tragedy. But we would experience this extraordinary musical power for what it is only if we were Greeks, because considering the entire development of Greek music, which is well known, quite familiar to us, and infinitely richer by comparison, we believe we are hearing only youthful songs, sung with only a timid sense of their power. The Greeks are, as the Egyptian priests say, eternal children, and where tragic art is concerned, only children who do not know what an exalted toy has arisen under their hands, something which will be destroyed. Every struggle of the spirit of music for pictorial and mythic revelation, which becomes increasingly intense from the beginning of the lyric right up to the Attic tragedy, suddenly breaks apart right after the developing in full luxuriant bloom, and, so to speak, disappears from the surface of Hellenic art, although the Dionysian worldview born out of this struggle lives on in the mysteries and in its most amazing transformation and degeneration never stops attracting serious natures to it. Isn't it possible that it will rise from its mystical depths as art once more? At this point, we are concerned with the question whether the power whose hostile effects broke tragedy has sufficient power for all time to hinder the artistic regrowth of tragedy and the tragic worldview. If the old tragedy was derailed by the dialectical drive for knowledge and by the optimism of scholarly research, we might have to infer from this fact an eternal struggle between the theoretical and the tragic worldviews. And only after the spirit of knowledge is taken right to its limits and its claim to universal validity destroyed by the establishment of that limit would it be possible to hope for a rebirth of tragedy. For a symbol of such a cultural form, we would have to set up Socrates, the player of music, in the sense talked about earlier. By this opposition, I understand with respect to the spirit of scholarly research the belief which first came to light in the person of Socrates, that our understanding of nature can be grounded and that knowledge has a universal healing power. Whoever remembers the most immediate consequences of this restless, forward-driving spirit of scientific knowledge will immediately recall how it destroyed myth, and how through this destruction poetry was driven out of its naturally ideal soil as something from now on without a home. If we have correctly ascribed to music the power to bring about out of itself a rebirth of myth, then we will have to seek out the spirit of science on that very path where it has its hostile encounter with the myth-creating power of music. This occurred in the development of the new Attic dithyramb, whose music no longer expressed the inner essence, the will itself, that only gave back an inadequate appearance and an imitation delivered through ideas. From such innerly degenerate music, those with a true musical nature turned away with the same aversion which they had displayed before the art-killing tendency of Socrates. The instinct of Aristophanes, which grasped issues so surely, was certainly right when he linked together Socrates himself, the tragedies of Euripides, and the music of the new writers of dithryambs, hating each of them and smelling, in all three of them, the characteristics of a degenerate culture. Through that new dithyramb, music is criminally turned into a mimetic demonstration of appearances, for example, a battle or storm at sea, and in the process is totally robbed of all its power to create myths. For when music seeks only to arouse our indulgence by compelling us to find external analogies between an event in life or nature and certain rhythmic figures and characteristic musical sounds, when our understanding is supposed to be satisfied with the recognition of these analogies, then we are dragged down into a mood in which a conception of the mythic is impossible. For myth must be vividly felt as a single instance of universality and truth staring into the infinite. Truly Dionysian music works on us as a universal mirror reflecting the will of the world. Each vivid event reflected in this mirror widens out at once for our feelings into the image of an eternal truth. By contrast, the sound painting of the new dithyramb immediately strips such a vivid event of its mythic character. Now the music has become a feeble copy of a phenomenon, and in the process, infinitely poorer than the phenomenon itself. Through this impoverishment, the phenomenon itself is even lowered in our feelings, so that now, for example, a battle imitated in this kind of music plays itself feebly out in marches, trumpet calls, and so forth, and our imagination is held back precisely by these superficialities. Painting with music is thus in every respect the opposite to the myth-creating power of true music. Through the former, a phenomenon becomes more impoverished than it is, whereas through Dionysian music, the individual phenomenon becomes richer and widens into an image of the world. It was a powerful victory of the non-Dionysian spirit when, in the development of the new dithyramb, it alienated music from itself and pushed it down to be the slave of appearances. Euripides, who in a higher sense must have had a thoroughly unmusical nature, is for this very reason an ardent supporter of the new dithyrambic music, and uses all its stock effects and styles with the open-handedness of a thief. From another perspective, we see the force of this un-Dionysian spirit in action, directing its effects against myth. When we turn our gaze toward the way in which the presentation of character and the psychological complexities get way out of hand in the tragedies of Sophocles. The character cannot be allowed to broaden out any more into an eternal type, but by contrast must appear an individual through the artistic qualifications and shading, through the most delicate clarity of every line, so that the spectator generally no longer experiences the myth, but the commanding naturalism of the artist, his power of imitation. Here also we become aware of the victory of appearances over the universal, and of the delight in the particular, rather like an anatomical specimen. Already we breathe the air of a theoretical world, which values the scientific insight higher than the artistic mirror image of a universal principle. The movement along the line of increasing characterization quickly goes further. While Sophocles still paints the whole characters and yokes of their sophisticated development to myth, Euripides already paints only large individual character traits, which are capable of expressing themselves in violent passions. In the new Attic comedy, there are masks with only one expression: reckless old men, deceived pimps, mischievous slaves, and an inexhaustible repetition. Where now has the myth-building spirit of music gone? What is left now for music is music of stimulation or memory, that is, either music as a means of stimulating jaded and worn-out nerves or sound painting. As far as the first is concerned, the text is largely irrelevant. Already in Euripides, when his heroes or chorus first start to sing, things get really out of hand. What must it have been like with his unapologetic successors? However, the new un-Dionysian spirit manifests itself with the utmost clarity in the conclusions of the new plays. In the old tragedy, the metaphysical consolation was there to feel at the conclusion. Without that, the delight in tragedy simply cannot be explained. The sound of reconciliation from another world echoes most purely perhaps in Oedipus at Colonus. But as soon as the genius of music flew away from the tragedy is, in the strong sense of the term, dead. For out of what are people now able to create that metaphysical consolation? Consequently, people looked for an earthly solution to tragic dissonance. After the hero was sufficiently tortured by fate, he was paid a well-earned reward in an impressive marriage, in divine testament to his honor. The hero became a gladiator, to whom people gave his freedom, after he had been well beaten and was covered with wounds. The Deus ex machina moved in to take the place of metaphysical consolation. I will not say that the tragic worldview was destroyed entirely and completely by the surging spirit of the un-Dionysian. We only know that it must have fled out of art as if into the underworld, degenerating into a secret cult. But over the widest surface area of Hellenistic existence raged the consuming wind of that spirit which announces itself in the form of Greek serenity, to which I referred earlier as an impotent and unproductive delight in life. This serenity is a counterpart to the marvelous naivete of the old Greeks, which we must see in accordance with its given characteristics as the flowering of Apollonian culture, blossoming out of a dark abyss as the victory over suffering, the wisdom of suffering, which the Hellenic will gains through its ability to mirror beauty. The noblest form of that other form of Greek serenity, the Alexandrian, is the cheerfulness of the theoretical man. It manifests the same characteristic features I already derived out of the idea of the un-Dionysian. It fights against Dionysian wisdom and art. It strives to dissolve myth. It places an earthy consonance in place of a metaphysical consolation, indeed a particular deus ex machina, namely the god of machines and crucibles, that is, the force of nature recognized and used in the service of a higher egoism. It believes in correcting the world through knowledge, a life led by scientific knowledge, and thus is really in a position to confine the individual man in the narrowest circle of problems, which can be solved, inside which he can cheerfully say to life, "I want you, you are worth knowing." Section 18. It's an eternal phenomenon. The voracious will always finds a way to keep its creatures alive and force them on to further living by an illusion spread over things. One man is fascinated by the Socratic desire for knowledge and the delusion that with it he'll be able to cure the eternal wound of existence. Another is caught up by the seductively beautiful veil of art fluttering before his eyes. Yet another by the metaphysical consolation that underneath the hurly-burly of appearances, eternal life flows on indestructibly, to say nothing of the more common and almost more powerful illusions which the will holds ready at all times. In general, these three stages of illusion are only for nobly endowed natures, those who feel the weight and difficulty of existence with more profound reluctance, and who need to be deceived out of this reluctance by these exquisite stimulants. Everything we call culture emerges from these stimulants, depending on the proportions of the mixture we have predominantly Socratic or artistic or tragic culture, or if you'll permit historical examples, there is either an Alexandrian or a Hellenic or a Buddhist culture. Our entire modern world is trapped in the net of Alexandrian culture and recognizes as its ideal the theoretical man, equipped with the highest intellectual powers and working in the service of science, a man for whom Socrates is the prototype and progenitor. All our methods of education originally have this ideal in view. Every other existence has struggled on with difficulty alongside this ideal as a way of life we permit, not as one we intend. For a long time now, it's been almost frightening to sense how an educated person here is found only in the form of the scholar. Even our literary arts have had to develop out of scholarly imitations, and in the main effect of rhyme we recognize still the development of our poetical form out of artificial experiments, with what is essentially really a scholarly language, not one native to us. To a true Greek, how incomprehensible must Faust have appeared, that man of modern culture, who is inherently intelligible to us. Faust, who storms dissatisfied through all faculties, his drive for knowledge making him devoted to magic and the devil. We have only to stand him beside Socrates for the comparison in order to recognize that modern man is beginning to have a premonition of the limits of that Socratic desire for knowledge, and is yearning for a coastline somewhere in the wide and desolate sea of knowledge. When Goethe once remarked to Eckermann with reference to Napoleon, "Yes, my good man, there is also productivity in actions." In a delightfully naive way, he was reminding us that the non-theoretical human being is something implausible and astonishing to modern man, so that we have had to have the wisdom of a Goethe to find out that such a strange form of existence is comprehensible, even forgivable. And now we must not conceal from ourselves what lies hidden in the womb of the Socratic culture, an optimism that thinks itself all-powerful. Well, people should not be surprised when the fruits of this optimism ripen, when a society that has been thoroughly leavened with this kind of culture, right down to the lowest levels, gradually starts trembling in an extravagant turmoil of desires, when the belief in earthly happiness for everyone, when faith in the possibility of such a universal knowledge, culture gradually changes into threatening demand for such an Alexandrian earthly happiness, into the invocation of a Euripides Deus ex machina. People should take note. Alexandrian culture requires a slave class in order to be able to exist over time. But with its optimistic view of existence, it denies the necessity for such a class, and thus, when the effect of its beautiful words of seduction and reassurance about the dignity of human beings and the dignity of work has worn off, it gradually moves towards a horrific destruction. There is nothing more frightening than a barbarian slave class which has learned to think of its existence as an injustice and is preparing to take revenge not only for itself, but for all generations. In the face of such threatening storms, who dares appeal with sure confidence to our pale and exhausted religions, which themselves in their foundations have degenerated into scholarly religions, so that myth, the essential precondition for all religions, is already everywhere paralyzed. Even in this area, that optimistic spirit which we have just described as the germ of destruction of our society has gained control. While the disaster slumbering in the bosom of theoretical culture gradually begins to worry modern man, and while he, in his uneasiness, reaches into the treasure of his experience for ways to avert the danger, without any inherent faith in these means, and while he also begins to have a premonition of his own particular consequences, some great and widely gifted natures have, with incredibly careful thought, known how to use the tools of science to set out the boundaries and relative nature of knowledge itself, and in the process decisively to deny the claim of science to universal validity and universal goals. With proofs like this, for the first time, that delusion which presumes, with the help of causality, to be able to ground the innermost essence of things has become recognized for what it is. The immense courage and wisdom of Kant and Schopenhauer achieved the most difficult victory, the one over the optimism lying concealed in the essential nature of logic, which is in turn the foundation of our culture. While this logic, based on eternal truths, which it did not consider open to objection, had believed that all the riddles of the world could be recognized and resolved, and had treated space, time, and causality as totally unconditional laws with the most universal validity, Kant showed how these really served only to raise mere appearance, the work of Maya, to the only reality, the highest reality, and to set it in place as the innermost and true essence of things, and thus to make true knowledge of this essence impossible. That is, to use an expression of Schopenhauer, to get the dreamer to sleep even more soundly. World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, page 498. With this recognition, there is introduced a culture which I venture to describe as a tragic culture. Its most important distinguishing feature is that wisdom replaces knowledge as the highest goal, a wisdom which, undeceived by the seductive diversions of science, turns its unswerving gaze towards the all-encompassing picture of the world, and with a sympathetic feeling of love, seeks in that world to grasp eternal suffering as its own suffering. Let's imagine a growing generation with this fearless gaze, this heroic attraction for what is immense. Let's imagine the bold step of these dragon slayers, the proud daring with which they turn their backs on all the doctrines of weakness belonging to that optimism, in order to live resolutely, fully, and completely. Would that not require the tragic man of this culture in his self-education for seriousness and terror to desire a new art, the art of metaphysical consolation, to desire tragedy as the Helen which belongs to him, and to have to cry out with Faust, "With my desire's power, should I not call into this life the fairest form of all?" However, now that Socratic culture has been shaken on two sides, once by the fear of its own consequences, which it is definitely beginning to sense, and in addition, because it is itself no longer convinced of the eternal validity of its foundations, with that earlier naive trust, it can hang onto the scepter of its infallibility only with trembling hands. So it's a sorry spectacle, how the dance of its thinking dashes longingly after new forms in order to embrace them, and then how, like Mephistopheles with the seductive Lamia, it suddenly with a shudder lets them go. That is, in fact, the characteristic mark of that fracture which everyone habitually talks about as the root malady of modern culture. That theoretical man is afraid of his own consequences, and in his dissatisfaction no longer dares to commit himself to the fearful ice currents of existence. He runs anxiously up and down along the shore. He no longer wants to have anything completely, any totality, with all the natural cruelty of things. That's how much the optimistic way of seeing things has mollycoddled him. At the same time, he feels how a culture which has been built on the principles of science must collapse when it begins to become illogical. That is, when it begins to run back, away from its own consequences. Our art reveals this general distress. In vain people use imitation to lean on the great productive periods and natures. In vain they gather all world literature around modern man to bring him consolation and place him in the middle of artistic styles and artists of all ages, so that he may, like Adam with the animals, give them a name. But he remains an eternally hungry man, the critic without joy and power, the Alexandrian man who is basically a librarian and copy editor and goes miserably blind from the dust of books and printing errors. Section 19. We can designate the innermost form of this Socratic culture most precisely when we call it the culture of opera, for in this area our Socratic culture, with characteristic naivete, has expressed its wishes and perceptions, something astonishing to us if we bring the genesis of opera and the fact of the development of opera together with the eternal truths of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. First, I recall the emergence of the representational style and of recitative. Is it credible that this entirely externalized opera music, something incapable of worship, could be accepted and preserved with wildly enthusiastic favor, as if it were the rebirth of all true music, in an age in which Palestrina's inexpressibly awe-inspiring and sacred music had just arisen? On the other hand, who would make the diversion-loving voluptuousness of the Florentine circles, or the vanity of its dramatic singers, responsible for such a rapidly spreading love of opera? The fact that in the same age, indeed in the same peoples, alongside the vaulted structure of Palestrina's harmonies, which the entire Christian Middle Ages had developed, there awoke that passion for a half-musical way of speaking, that I can only explain by some tendency beyond art, something also at work in the very nature of the recitative. To the listener who wishes to hear clearly the word under the singing, there corresponds the singer who speaks more than he sings, and who intensifies the expressions of pathos and half-singing. Through this intensification of pathos, he makes the words easier to understand, and overpowers what's left of the musical half. The real danger now threatening him is that, at an inopportune moment, he may give the music the major emphasis, so that the pathos in the speech and the clarity of the words necessarily disappear. On the other hand, he always feels the urge for musical release and a virtuoso presentation of his voice. Here, the quote-unquote poet comes to his assistance, the man who knows how to provide him sufficient opportunities for lyrical interjections, repetitions of words and sentences, and so on, places where the singer can now rest in a purely musical element, without considering the words. This alternation of only half-sung speech, full of urgent emotion and interjections, which are all singing, which lies at the heart of the representative style, this rapidly changing effort at one moment to affect the understanding and imagination of the listener, and at another to work on his musical senses, is something so completely unnatural and at the same time so innerly contradictory to the Dionysian and Apollonian artistic drives, that we must conclude that the origin of recitative lies outside all artistic instincts. According to this account, we should define recitative as the mixing of epic and lyric performing, but not at all in an innerly consistent blending, which could have never been attained with such entirely disparate things, but the most external conglutination in the style of a mosaic, something like of which has no model whatsoever in the realm of nature and experience. But this was not the opinion of those inventors of recitative. Rather, they, along with their age, believed that through the representative style the secret of ancient music had been resolved, and that only through it could one explain the tremendous effect of an Orpheus, Amphion, and indeed even of Greek tragedy. The new style was valued as the reawakening of the most effective music, the music of the ancient Greeks. In fact, under the universal and totally popular conception of the Homeric world as the primitive world, people allowed themselves to surrender to the dream that they had now climbed down back once more into the paradisal beginnings of humankind, when music necessarily must have had that superb purity, power, and innocence which the poets knew how to talk about so movingly in their pastoral plays. Here we see the innermost development of this truly modern style of art, the opera. A powerful need forces itself out in art, but it is a need of an unesthetic sort, the yearning for the idyllic, the belief in a primordial existence of the artistic and good man. Recitative served as the rediscovered language of that primordial man, and opera as the rediscovered land of that idyllic or heroically good beginning, who in all his actions at the same time follows a naturalistic artistic drive, who sings at least something in everything he has to say, so that given the slightest emotional arousal, he can immediately sing out in full voice. For us now, it is unimportant that contemporary humanists use this newly created picture of the paradisal artist to fight against the old church idea of human beings as inherently corrupt and lost, so that opera is to be understood as the opposing dogma of good people, something in which they simultaneously discovered a way of consoling themselves against that pessimism to which the serious-minded people of that time, given the horrifying uncertainties of all social conditions, were attracted most strongly. It's enough for us to recognize how the real magic, and thus the origin of this new artistic form, lies in the satisfaction of an entirely unesthetic need, in the optimistic glorification of man as such, in its view of primitive man as naturally good in artistic man. This operatic principle has gradually transformed itself into a threatening and terrible demand, which we, faced with the socialist movement of the present day, can no longer fail to hear. The good primitive man wants his rights. What paradisal prospects! Alongside this point, I set another equally clear confirmation of my opinion that opera is constructed on the same principles as our Alexandrian culture. Opera is the birth of theoretical man, of the critical layman, not of the artist, one of the strangest facts in the history of all the arts. It was the demand of completely unmusical listeners that people had to hear the words above all, so that a rebirth of music was only to be expected, when some way of singing was discovered, according to which the words of the text rule over the counterpoint, the way a lord rules over his servants. For the words, they said, are nobler than the accompanying harmonic system, just as the soul is nobler than the body. In the beginning of opera, the union of music, image, and word was treated according to that amateurish and unmusical crudity of these views. The first experiments with the sense of this aesthetic were launched in distinguished amateur circles in Florence by the poets and singers patronized there. The man who is artistically impotent produces for himself a form of art precisely because he is the inherently inartistic man. Because he has no sense of the Dionysian depths of music, for his own sake he transforms musical taste into easy-to-understand verbal and musical rhetoric of the passions and the representative style, and into the voluptuousness of the art of singing. Because he is incapable of seeing a vision, he presses mechanics and decorative artists into his service. Because he has no idea how to grasp the true essence of the artist, he conjures up right in front of him the artistic primitive man to suit his own taste. That is, the man who, when passionate, sings and speaks verse. He dreams himself back in an age in which passion was sufficient to produce songs and poems, as if that feeling has ever been in a position to create something artistic. The precondition of opera is a false belief about the artistic process. It is, in fact, the idyllic faith that in reality every sensitive man is an artist. According to the meaning of this belief, opera is the expression of lay amateurs in art, something which dictates its laws with the cheerful optimism of theoretical man. If we wanted to bring together into a single conception both of these ideas I have just described in connection with the origin of opera, all we would have left to do is to speak of an idyllic tendency in opera, and the only things we would need to use are Schiller's way of expressing himself in his explanation. He claimed that nature and the ideal are either an object of sorrow, when the former is represented as lost and the latter as unattained, or both are an object of joy, when they are represented as real. The first produces the elegy in a narrower sense, and the other produces the idyll in its broadest sense. And right away we must draw attention to the common characteristic of both of these ideas in the genesis of opera, that in them the ideal does not register as unattained and nature does not register as lost. According to this feeling, there was a primordial time for man when he lay on the heart of nature, and with this state of nature simultaneously attained the ideal of humanity and paradisal goodness and artistry. We all are said to have descended from these perfect primitive men. Indeed, we still were their faithful image. We only had to cast some things away from us in order to recognize ourselves once again as these primitive people, thanks to a voluntary renunciation of superfluous scholarship, of lavish culture. Through this operatic imitation of Greek tragedy, the educated man of the Renaissance let himself be led back to such a harmony of nature and the ideal, to an idyllic reality. He used this tragedy, as Dante used Virgil, to be brought right up to the gates of paradise, while from this point on he strode even further on his own, and passed over from an imitation of the highest Greek art form to a restoration of all things, to a copy of man's original art world. What a confident good nature there is in these audacious attempts, right in the bosom of theoretical culture. Something to be explained only by the comforting faith that man in himself is the eternally virtuous hero of opera, the eternally piping or singing shepherd, who must always in the end rediscover himself as such, should he find out some time or other that he has really lost himself for a while, something which is only the fruit of that optimism which here arises out of the depths of the Socratic worldview, like a sweetly seductive fragrant column of air. Hence, among the characteristics of opera, there is no sense at all of that elegiac pain of eternal loss. There is rather the cheerfulness of an eternal rediscovery, the comfortable joy in an idyllic reality, which man can at least imagine for himself at all times. But in doing this, man may perhaps at some point suspect that this imagined reality is nothing other than a fantastically silly indulgence. Anyone able to measure this against the fearful seriousness of the true nature, and to compare it with the actual primitive scenes of the beginnings of humanity, would have to cry out in disgust, "Get rid of that phantom!" Nevertheless, we would be deceiving ourselves if we believed that such a playful being as opera could be chased away simply by a powerful shout like a ghost. Whoever wants to destroy opera must undertake the struggle against the Alexandrine cheerfulness, which expresses its favorite idea so naively in opera. In fact, opera is its real artistic form. But what can we expect for art itself from the effect of a form of art whose origins in general do not lie in the aesthetic realm, but which have rather stolen from a half-moralistic sphere over the realm of art, and which can deceive people about its hybrid origin only now and then? On what juices does this parasitic operatic being feed itself, if not from the sap of true art? Are we not to assume that under the influence of opera's idyllic seductions and its Alexandrine arts of flattering, the highest task of art, the one we should take really seriously, saving from the eye from a glimpse into the horror of the night, and through the healing balm of illusion, rescuing the subject from the spasms brought about by the strivings of the will, would degenerate into a trend to empty and scattered diversion? What happens to the eternal truths of the Dionysian and the Apollonian in such a mixture of styles, of the sort I have set down as the essence of the representational style, where the music is considered the servant and the libretto the master, where the music is compared to the body and the libretto to the soul, where the highest goal at best will aim at a descriptive tone painting, as it was earlier with the new Attic Dithrium, where the music is completely alienated from its true office, which is to be a Dionysian world mirror, so that the only thing left for it is to imitate the essential forms of appearances, like a slave of phenomena, and to arouse superficial entertainment in the play lines and proportions. A rigorous examination shows how this fatal influence of opera on music coincides precisely with the entire development of modern music. The optimism lurking in the genesis of opera and in the essence of the culture represented through opera succeeded with alarming speed in stripping music of its Dionysian world meaning and stamping on it a formally playful and entertaining character. This transformation can only be compared to something like the metamorphosis of Aeschylean man into the Alexandrian cheerful man. If, in the explanation given above, we have been right to link the disappearance of the Dionysian spirit with an extremely striking but so far unexplainable transformation and degeneration of Greek man, what hopes must revive in us when the most certain favorable signs bring us the guarantee of the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our contemporary world? It is not possible that the divine power of Hercules should remain always impotent in voluptuous bondage to Omphale. Out of the Dionysian foundation of the Germanic spirit, a power has arisen which has nothing in common with the most basic assumptions of Socratic culture, something those assumptions cannot explain or excuse. Rather, from the point of view of this culture, it is experienced as something terrible which cannot be explained, as something overpoweringly hostile, and that is German music, above all as it is to be understood in its forceful orbit from Bach to Beethoven, from Beethoven to Wagner. Even in the best circumstances, what can the Socratic man of our day, greedy for knowledge, begin to make of this daemon rising from the inexhaustible depths? Neither from the lacework or arabesques of operatic melodies, nor with the help of the arithmetic abacus, a fugue, and contrapuntal dialectic, will a formula reveal itself in whose triple-powered light people can render that daemon obsequious and compel it to speak. What a spectacle when our aestheticians nowadays, with the fishing net of beauty, all their own, strike at and try to catch that musical genius roaming about in front of them with incredible life, with movements which will not be judged according to eternal beauty, any more than according to notions of the sublime. We should only inspect these patrons of music in person and at close quarters when they cry out so tirelessly, "Beauty! Beauty!" to see whether they look like educated and discriminating darling children of nature, or whether they are not rather seeking a deceptively euphemistic form for their own crudity, an aesthetic pretext for their characteristically unfeeling sobriety. Here, for example, I am thinking of Otto Jahn. But the liar and the hypocrite should beware of German music, for in the midst of all our culture, it is precisely the one unalloyed, pure, and purifying fire spirit, out of which and towards which all things move in a double orbit, as in the doctrine of the great Heraclitus of Ephesus. Everything which we now call culture, education, and civilization must at some point appear before the unerring judge Dionysus. Furthermore, let's remember how the spirit of German philosophy in Kant and Schopenhauer, streaming from the same springs, was able to annihilate the contented joy in existence of scholarly Socratism by demonstrating its boundaries, and how with this demonstration an infinitely deeper and more serious consideration of ethical questions in art was introduced, which we can truly ascribe as Dionysian wisdom, conceptually understood. Where does the mystery of this unity between German music and German philosophy point, if not to a new form of existence, about whose meaning we can inform ourselves only by speculating on the basis of analogies with the Greeks? For the Greek model has this immeasurable value for us who stand on the borderline between two different forms of existence, that in it are stamped all those transitions and struggles in a classically instructive form, except that we are, as it were, living through the great high points of Greek being in the reverse order. For example, we seem to be moving now out of an Alexandrian period backwards into a period of tragedy. At the same time, we feel as if the birth of a tragic time period for the German spirit only means a return to itself, a blessed rediscovery of self, after immensely powerful forces from outside had for a long time forced it into the servitude under their form, since that spirit, so far as form is concerned, lived in helpless barbarism. And now finally, after its return home to the original spring of its being, it can dare to stride in here before all peoples, bold and free, without the guiding reins of Roman civilization. If only it can now understand how to learn all the time from a single people, the Greeks. Being capable of learning from them is already a high honor and a remarkable distinction. And when have we needed these most eminent of mentors more than now, when we are experiencing the rebirth of tragedy, and are in danger of not knowing where it is coming from, or being able to interpret where it is going? Section 20. At some point, under the gaze of an incorruptible judge, we may determine in what ages and in which men up to now the German spirit has struggled most powerfully to learn from the Greeks. And if we can assume with some confidence that this extraordinary praise must be awarded to the noblest cultural struggles of Goethe, Schiller, and Winckelmann, then we would certainly have to add that since that time and the most recent developments of that battle, the attempt to attain a culture and to reach the Greeks by the same route has become incomprehensibly weaker and weaker. In order to avoid being forced into total despair about the German spirit, shouldn't we conclude from all this that in some important point or other these fighters were not successful in penetrating the Hellenic spirit and creating a lasting bond of love between German and Greek culture? And beyond that, perhaps an unconscious recognition of this failure gives rise in serious people to the enervating doubt whether, after such predecessors, they could go even further than these men had along this cultural path and reach their goal at all. For that reason, since that time we've seen judgments about the educational value of the Greeks degenerate in the most disturbing way. We can hear expressions of sympathetic condescension in the most varied encampments of the spirit and of the lack of spirit. In other places, a completely ineffectual sweet talk flirts with Greek harmony, Greek beauty, and Greek cheerfulness. And precisely in the circles which could dignify themselves by drawing tirelessly from the Greek riverbed in order to benefit German education, the circles of teachers in the institutes of higher education, people have learned best to come to terms with the Greeks early and in a comfortable manner, often with a skeptical abandoning of the Hellenic ideal and a total reversal of the real purpose of classical studies. In general, anyone in these circles who hasn't completely exhausted himself in the effort to be a dependable corrector of old texts or a microscopic studier of language, like some natural historians, may perhaps also seek to acquire Greek antiquity historically, as well as other antiquities, but in any case following the methods of our present scholarly writing, along with their supercilious expressions. If, as a result, the real cultural power of our institutions of higher learning has certainly never been lower and weaker than at present, if the journalist, the paper slave of the day, has won his victory over the professors, so far as culture is concerned, and the only thing still left for the latter is the frequently experienced metamorphosis which has them also moving around these days with the speech styles of a journalist, with the light elegance of the sphere, like cheerful, well-educated butterflies, then how awkward and confusing it must be for people living in such a present and educated in this manner to stare at that phenomenon of the revival of the Dionysian spirit and the rebirth of tragedy, something which may only be understood by some analogy to the most profound principles of the yet as incomprehensible Hellenic genius. There is no other artistic period in which so-called culture and true art have stood more alienated from and averse to each other than what we witness with our own eyes nowadays. We understand why such a weak culture despises true art, for it fears such art will destroy it. But surely an entire form of culture, i.e., the Socratic Alexandrian, must have run its full life after being able to culminate in such a delicate and insignificant point as our present culture. When heroes like Schiller and Goethe couldn't succeed in breaking down that enchanted door which leads to the Hellenic magic mountain, when for all their most courageous struggles they reached no further than that yearning gaze which Goethe's Iphigenia sent from barbaric Taurus over the sea towards her home, what is left for the imitators of such heroes to hope for, unless from some totally different side, untouched by all the efforts of previous culture, the door might suddenly open on its own, to the accompaniment of the mysterious sound of the reawakened music of tragedy. Let no one try to detract from our belief in a still imminent rebirth of Hellenic antiquity, for that's the only place where we find our hope for a renewal and reformation of the German spirit through the fiery magic of music. What would we otherwise know to name which, amid the desolation and weariness of contemporary culture, could awaken some comforting expectation for the future? We look in vain for a single powerfully branching root, for a spot of fertile and healthy soil, but everywhere there is dust, sand, ossification, and decay. Here a desperate, isolated man couldn't choose a better symbol than the knight with death and the devil as Dürer has drawn him for us, the knight in armor with the hard bronze gaze, who knows how to make his way along his terrible path without wavering at his horrific companions, and yet without any hope, alone with his horse and hound. Such a Dürer knight was our Schopenhauer. He lacked all hope, but he wanted the truth. There is no one like him. But how suddenly that wilderness of such an exhausted culture as the one I have just sketched out so gloomily changes when the Dionysian magic touches it. A tempest seizes everything worn out, rotten, broken apart, and stunted, wraps it in a red whirling cloud of dust, and lifts it like a vulture up into the air. In our bewilderment, our gaze seeks out what has disappeared. For what we see has risen up from the oblivion into golden light, so full and green, so richly alive, so immeasurable and full of longing. Tragedy sits in the midst of this superfluity of life, suffering, and joy. With awe-inspiring delight, it listens to a distant melancholy song, which tells of the mothers of being whose names are delusion, will, and woe. Yes, my friends, believe with me in the Dionysian life and in the rebirth of tragedy. The age of the Socratic man is over. Crown yourselves with ivy. Take the thyrus stalk in your hand, and don't be amazed when tigers and panthers lie down fawning at your feet. Only now you must dare to be tragic men, for you will be redeemed. You are to lead the Dionysian celebratory procession from India to Greece. Arm yourselves for a hard battle, but have faith in the miracles of your God. This is the end of Part 5 of The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.